Would you please put your hands together and welcome to Dayton, Ohio for the first time, Dr. David Emanuel.
Thank you very much for that welcome. Thank you just for an opportunity to come here and to share with you a few things. I have to thank James particularly for the invite. It's a pleasure for me as somebody who, I don't like to think of myself as a scholar. I think of myself someone who just reads Bible and tries to understand it. But it's a pleasure not just to be able to read, but it's a double pleasure to be able to share the things that you've learned rather than running around having all of these things bottled up all of the time. And so it's a great joy that I can actually have an opportunity like this to share with you some of the things I've picked up. And this whole topic which I've chosen, the idea of the Exodus motif in the Bible, it's something which is it's been running about in my head for at least 14 years in various guises. So I've kind of, when I told James I chose the topic of the Exodus motif, I then had to put everything down on paper in some kind of a logical order. But that's something which I've been dying to do for a very long time. So I thank James, I thank for the invite. I have to do this. I have to thank my daughter, Tamar, for letting me come. It's her birthday today. She's 14. And so I have to thank her for letting me come and be with you today as well. I have to at least mention that. Before I go into the topic, I have to say a few words about me. The first thing I know, I get up here and I speak, and the first thing you're thinking is, well, you're not from around here, are you? And you'd be right. You'd be quite right. I was born in the UK, in London, like a suburb of London, and I was raised there, and my first career was actually computer science, and I was doing very well in the field of computer science. I was doing very, very well in the field, and I married a doctor, and we were married for a year, and after that year, we came to a point. I had finished my studies, and we came to a point at which we thought, wouldn't it be nice if we just took a year off and came back and new jobs and better jobs and lived our lives? That's the way in which that's what our thinking was at the time. Also, around about the time I got married, I was introduced to a gentleman called Dwight Pryor. And I was introduced to his teachings by some very dear friends of mine. And his teachings, that what we were learning there, not just Dwight, but also others, members from the Jerusalem School of Synoptic Research, and it had set alight in me something that I had no control of, and I didn't know at the time, but it was obviously directing me and leading me in a particular direction. So I had this in mind when we went to Israel. Of all the places to take a year off, that's where we actually went. So we went to Israel, and before I left for Israel, I specifically went to my accountant, and I spoke about setting up a business. And we spoke, and he drew up a shell contract for me and a shell business, so that we go over 9 months to a year. We come back, I'm going to sit down, I'm going to have a business, and it's going to be really cool. 1 year in Israel College of the Bible. 2 years in Israel, Hebrew University, MA. First year of the MA, 3 years in Israel. And this is how it goes on. And it's an 11-year period in the end. So after that 11 years, I still have a business at home in England somewhere that I can pick up on, but I haven't thought about doing that seriously. But that 11 years of learning, of being at the Hebrew University was, obviously it was a life-changing and absolutely fantastic period. Whilst there I had 5 children, all born in Israel. They call them Sabras, but they're not quite Sabras, but they're nevertheless born in Israel, all of them born in Jerusalem. Whilst there, I studied Hebrew University of Jerusalem. I was there for 10 years, 1 year at the Israel College of the Bible. I also started going to a congregation one of our decisions we had, even though we thought we were going to be in Israel for 1 year, one of the things we did, and I highly recommend if any of you goes to Israel for a year, do the same thing. We said we are going to sit inside an Hebrew-speaking congregation. And we were 4 months in Israel, and we took that decision and we went to a Hebrew-speaking congregation. Now, was it frustrating? Absolutely. There were some good days, and there were some bad days. There were some good days when you picked up, 60, 70% of what was said. There were some bad days when we would come home, and what on earth were they talking about? That's how our discussions began. But within a year, 2 years, it was the best decision, one of the best decisions I've ever made in my life, because that is the only time you can understand what is going on in Israel when you are speaking to Israeli believers who see things very differently, incredibly differently from expat communities or communities of people who are coming in from outside and setting up little French congregations or little English congregations and stuff like that, getting involved within the Hebrew-speaking congregations. And that's something which we did. I was an elder at a congregation in Ma'aleh Adumim, just outside of Jerusalem. I was there, elder there for about 3 years before we left back here. So that was a fantastic experience as well, not just being a part, but having a leadership role and being able to contribute into the lives of Israeli believers was an enormous privilege and an enormous joy. Whilst in Israel, I also had an opportunity, and this was really coming here to Dayton, Ohio, of all places, really surreal, because whilst in Israel, I was involved in a group called eTeacher, Hebrew Online. And I've been teaching there, I teach there now as well. We do online courses for biblical Hebrew. And I coming here, of all places in Dayton, I actually meet people who have taken courses. And it's amazing on Hebrew Online. So I've never actually seen what it's like on the other side of it and how it actually looks. But they seem quite pleased with it. So that's something else I didn't. It's really, really amazing. I returned to the UK after I finished my doctoral studies in Israel. I was there for 2 years, doing my own independent research. I was trying to get some work done. I tried to get got an article published in that 2-year period. And that's when I got, it was 2010, I got a phone call from Dr. Stephen Notley and on a Thursday about a job opening at NIAC. On a Friday, I received tickets. 2 weeks later, I was in New York for the interview, and I had a job. And it was just like that. My whole life had changed. And we had to move our family once again over here to the United States. And that's why I teach at NIAC College. I teach, right now we're just opening up a new program. I'll speak a bit about that later on in intertestamental period and ancient Christian origins. I teach in that, and I also teach in the Old Testament department, and I teach biblical Hebrew as well. So it's kind of ironic that the person who really kicked things off for me in the United Kingdom, it is his shoes I'm almost standing in now, and he's brought me all the way back to this place, and it really is amazing. And it's kind of, for me, it helps. It makes this a special occasion for me that I'm able to actually do this. On to the topic of that we're looking at today. Introduction to that topic. First, want to mention. I need to say how I came about it. My first year at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, I had heard of the work of a particular professor, Dr. Yair Zakovich. And I'd heard about his work, and I said, I really want to study under this guy. He looked at the literary study of the Bible, so it was very much, he dealt with the text of the Bible. He didn't deal too much with historicity, and there are lots of theories concerning the Bible and its composition. He didn't deal too much with that. He dealt with the literature. We deal with what's in front of us now. We address it with what we have rather than trying to go too far afield to understand it. So I worked with him, and he gave me one of his articles on Psalm 78. He gave his Hebrew article, big, thick Hebrew article, and he said, here, take this. And he said, what I've done with Psalm 78, you do with Psalm 105. And I said, okay. So I took it and I plowed through this article, and I wrote my first paper for him. And as I read it, his one on Psalm 78, an Exodus psalm, and I read the psalm and thought, wow, you know, this is all about the Exodus. Amazing. And I thought I knew the Exodus story, and I really didn't. I really didn't know it at all. I didn't appreciate it for what it was. But by the time I'd finished this first paper for him, I wrote my paper, and I remember writing, and I was kind of, as I had read and I had understood it, I wrote, one of the lines I wrote was, the Exodus motif is one of the most influential stories in the Bible. That's what I wrote. And I was a little bit kind of afraid. I didn't know this was a very respected professor. And I was thinking, wow, how's he going to treat that statement? And when I got my paper back, he crossed off one of. The most influential story in the whole of the Bible. And I thought, wow, that's what I felt, that's what I thought, but I was simply too afraid to say it. But he did it for me. It is the most influential story of the Bible. And I'm to this day, if, you know, new believers, my desire would always be, teach them the Exodus. Take them through the Exodus, and then everything else makes sense. Everything else falls into place. Take them through the Exodus. I'm not saying the Gospels aren't bad. I'm not saying Jesus isn't bad. I'm not saying doctrines of salvation aren't bad. I'm saying teach them the Exodus first, okay? And then from there, we can step out, and things will make so much more sense. The three major feasts of Israel are based on what? They're based on the Exodus. Pesach, the Passover. This is the deliverance. Then we have 7 weeks from there, we have Shavuot, the Feast of Weeks, the giving of the law. That's celebrated right there. Then we have the season we're in now. We have Tabernacles. We have Sukkot. Again, that is a call to remember the time the Israelites were in the desert and they dwelt in booths. These three feasts are very important. They're called the Regalim. Regalim, which means they're three pilgrimage feasts that men have to make. They have to go up 3 times a year to present themselves, to show themselves in Jerusalem to celebrate these feasts. And I want to take a quick side detour here. That's a very important thing that they're doing, that they're being asked to do, to present themselves. I start talking quickly when I'm getting excited, so I have to calm down. Let me calm down now. It's a very important thing that they have to do. And I was just, as I was sitting down there, I looked up, there's this passage here. It affects you too, I think, as well. This is a passage I picked up, Deuteronomy 14:22. You shall truly tithe all the increase of your grain that the field produces year by year. And you shall eat before the Lord your God in the place where he chooses to make his name abide. That's Jerusalem. The tithe of your grain and your new wine and of your oil, of your firstborn, of the herds and of your flocks, that you may learn to fear the Lord your God always. I'm not preaching prosperity here, by the way. But if the journey is too long for you, so that you're not able to carry the tithe, or if the place where the Lord your God chooses to put your name is too far from you, when the Lord your God has blessed you, then you shall exchange it for money. Take the money in your hand and go to the place which the Lord your God chooses. And you shall spend the money for whatever your heart desires, for oxen or sheep, for wine or similar drink. For whatever your heart desires, you shall eat there before the Lord your God, and you shall rejoice, you and your household. I bring this text up because it's one of the things which the Regalim, they have to do the Regalim. So if you live in Israel and you live in Haifa, 3 times a year, you have to come up to Jerusalem to celebrate these things. You have to bring your tithe up as well. Now, if your tithe is perishable, you sell whatever you have, and you take your money, and you go to Jerusalem, and you celebrate. Why? Because you're helping the Jerusalem economy. You are feeding into the Jerusalem economy. And this is really, really important. You're feeding into the temple system. You're feeding into the community, the priests, the Levites, and everybody who's actually there. This is really important because I think it's relevant for you, because when you go to Jerusalem, you think you're going on holiday. But you're kind of fulfilling this command right here. You're taking what you've earned, you're spending money in Jerusalem, and you are feeding into that economy in Jerusalem. And it's a great thing. It's a great thing. Oh, yeah, you're going to have a great time, but it's a great thing that you actually do this. It's a form of pilgrimage. It's a form of paying back, if you like, in that sense. So, back to where I was, the Regalim. Pesach, Shavuot, and Sukkot. Those three feasts, all based on the Exodus motif. The Exodus motif is a story about how Israel actually became a nation, how it was born. And even that in itself is beautiful because it's a lesson that the whole nation was born out of humility. It was born out of bondage and slavery. It was born out of helplessness. That's how it came into being. It's not one of these grand stories of people descending from gods or anything like that. It is a story of humility and is a story of grace and compassion. That is where they started their life. That is how they started. And so anything that they have, any nation that they've been built up, they should fully understand that it has come through an act of grace and mercy and through nothing that they have done themselves. That's what it should be done. And that's when, if you remember the Exodus always, that is something which you should carry with you and that should change your attitude. And that's something which I'm going to talk about a bit later on. So we have the Exodus motif. What I want to do this morning, approximately in 3 divisions. The first thing I really want to do is to go through the Exodus motif, talk you through the individual accounts, some of the individual accounts, the more pertinent individual accounts from the book of Exodus going through into the book of Numbers, and lay down a foundation to make sure that we're all on the same page. I take it for granted. My head is in this stuff for too long. My wife is always telling me, but David, people don't know that. David, people don't know that. And so I'm trying to take a step back and trying to get us all on the same page so we know what we're talking about when we're dealing with the Exodus motif. From that point in the second section, I want to look at ways in which the Exodus motif echoes, the ways in which it touches out and reaches into the Hebrew Bible, into the Old Testament. And then in our third session, I want to show you how this controlling motif also reaches out and indeed dominates the New Testament as well. So it's approximately those 3 areas are really where I actually want to go. So to begin with, we have to go to, obviously, to the book of Exodus, I think. Beginning of Exodus, and we see this record of Jacob going down into Egypt, physically down. Everything is down. When you're in Israel, you always go down, physically down from Jerusalem to anywhere else, and then from Israel you go down to wherever else you're going due to its elevation. But we have Jacob going down. 70 souls in all go down due to a famine that has hit the country. He goes to join his son Joseph. Whilst there, they settle down, obviously, in the land of Goshen, and a new king arises, doesn't recognize what Joseph has done, and this is where the problems begin. We have the children of Israel begin multiplying. That is not, people don't speak about that much, but it is really important, the fact that the children of Israel multiply in this way. If you begin to do the numbers, you will see that something bordering on miraculous is going on from the numbers of people, 70 people that go in, and then within a few hundred years, you get nearly 500,000 coming out. That's a lot of multiplication. Now, nothing is said in the text in Exodus, but at least we'll see later on, there are other authors that interpret this, and they see that God's hand has played a part in this multiplication that takes place. So Pharaoh decides to, what he calls, deal wisely with these Israelites that are multiplying at this incredible rate. And he begins by trying to kill the firstborn males. They are to be thrown into the river. We're going to come back to that idea and that motif in just a moment. So they're to be thrown into the river. They're basically to be killed. And if a child is born and it's a girl, a woman, then that's okay. They can live. But the men he's afraid of will come together with his enemies and fight against him. So he has to do this. And we have very interesting accounts, or a few interesting accounts as to what happens. And this is a phenomenal instance of biblical irony. Biblical irony. We have an account, first of all, of the midwives. We have midwives who, first they say to Pharaoh, look, we've tried to carry out your orders, but we can't. By the time we come to the birthing stones, the children are already born. And so we can't get to them to carry them out. Now, I raise the question of the midwives because these women have a critical role in the deliverance of Israel. And this is the whole irony. Pharaoh is thinking, men are dangerous. They're going to destroy me. So he tries to kill the men. And the women throttle him. They absolutely throttle him. The women here, the midwives, they don't carry out his order, so the men continue to multiply. Who is it who saves the deliverer of Israel? Pharaoh's daughter. She saves Moses, brings him into her own household, their own household, and raises the deliverer of Israel. And then you've got poor little Miriam, the little girl, sees what's going on and calls the own mother to wet nurse this boy. So you've got the situation where men are the perceived threat, but women are destroying you. And it's just a beautiful case of biblical irony, absolute biblical irony. The danger isn't always where you think it's going to be. So we've got this situation going on, and then we have chapters 2 and 3. You've got this instance of Moses as he grows up in the household, learns Egyptian, a very intelligent and wise man. He would have had a very good education, a very good Egyptian education. You have to keep that in mind as well as he grew up. And then we have this instance where he kills the Egyptian. He kills an Egyptian man for mistreating an Israelite. That's a critical story, very critical story, because it reveals something about Moses. It reveals something about his knowledge of his destiny. Nothing is spoken of, if you've noticed, when you read the Exodus account. Nothing is more said of it. It just says that he kills this guy, kills this Egyptian guy, and he moves on. And this is kind of like a taste of where we're going. We have this idea of a biblical text. Something more is going on. We don't find that something more out from the text. But if you go and you look at how somebody else views and interprets that text, then we can get a nice idea of what's going on, or a slightly better idea of what's going on. So if we turn to the book of Acts 7:23 to 25. I left my normal Bible at home, so I'm going to have to do this via an electronic device. I feel I don't actually like this, but it nevertheless has to do. Acts 7:23. And this is Stephen making this long narrative before he dies. Now, when he was 40 years old, that's Moses, it came into his heart to visit his brethren, the children of Israel. And seeing one of them suffer wrong, he defended and avenged him who was oppressed and struck down the Egyptian. For he supposed that his brethren would have understood that God would deliver them by his hand, but they did not understand. What is going on here? Stephen here is giving us an insight into what's happening. At this time when Moses kills the Egyptian, he thinks, God has called me to do this, I'm going to begin doing it now. God called him to do something, but the time wasn't right. God did call him to deliver the Israelites, but the time wasn't right. How important, how critical. This is a church, and it makes me get all kind of churchy and preachy, and I don't want to do that. But it's so often is the case, it's not a question of has God called you to do it. It's a question of is it now? Does he really want you to do that now, or is there another time for which that's going to happen? If someone as great as Moses can make that mistake, then we can make it too. Okay? So Moses doesn't quite figure out what's going on. He makes this mistake, he kills this Egyptian, and then he has to flee, and he goes off to Midian, and he goes off to live with Jethro, and it's there that he was taking his sheep out. He has this encounter with this God, with this burning bush, the bush that burns but is not consumed. And he has this encounter with a holy God. And it's there that God reveals himself. It says who he is. I am who I am. And I don't want to get into the divine name, but that exchange that goes on when God says who he is, there's a beautiful play on Hebrew words, because the words for I am, the words to be, ehyeh, is very clearly tied up with the Tetragrammaton and the name of God himself. So it very much is that idea of God being at all times, constantly, in the past and in the future, that is very much caught up in the divine name itself, the Tetragrammaton, the Yud-Hey, Vav-Hey. So that's a wonderful exchange, but we're not here to talk about that just yet. So Moses, he's there, and he has this encounter, and that's when God tells him, now you're going to go, strange enough, now you're going to go and deliver them. But it would appear as though Moses really does not, or has lost the taste for deliverance, because he goes into this whole thing of, oh, but I can't speak, and oh, but please send somebody else, but oh, but look at me, and so on and so forth. But then God sends him and says, look, just take Aaron, he'll be your mouthpiece, just go. You get the feeling God is getting really upset at this particular time. So he goes back to Egypt and causes a bit of a stir, and we see the seeds of complaint there, right there, when he goes back and he first speaks to Pharaoh, and the multiplication of the quota of bricks they have to do is multiplied without straw, and there are complaints. And this is where it begins, and it goes on throughout the whole of the story, the complaints, the whining, and the crying of the Israelites. It very much begins there. So he goes back, and as the tension escalates, he confronts Pharaoh, and he says, let my people go. And it is, we see in Exodus, it is Moses, it is Aaron, predominantly, who go and who speak and who very much initiate the plagues against them. There are 10 plagues in Exodus. We're going to see if that is replicated elsewhere in the Bible, and we'll see that it's actually not, but that's another story. We'll get there later on. 10 plagues: blood, frogs, gnats, flies, a cattle plague of some sort, boils, hail, locust, darkness, and the firstborn. 10 plagues, quite simple and quite straightforward, kind of. This fourth plague, where it says in your Bible, flies. It says the flies. I just want to let you know that the word flies is not in the Hebrew Bible at all. At all. Hebrew has a word for flies. It has a beautiful word for flies. If you want to talk about flies, you talk about zvuvim, zvuv, in a passage, wonderful passage in the book of Ecclesiastes. Ecclesiastes 10:1, dead flies make the perfumer's oil stink. That's a zvuv. That is these little things that buzz about. That's what it is, and they make a perfumer's oil stink when they die in it, apparently. So that's the word for flies. That word doesn't appear in Exodus. It's not here. In Exodus, we have the word arov, and this was one of my first major discoveries when I was reading this book. I said arov, and I looked it up, and I said it doesn't mean flies. It means something else. It means a swarm. It means an admixture. It means a bunch of things swarming together. No specific size is given, but that's what it means, arov. And that obviously kicks off. So, well, where do we get the idea of flies from? We get the idea from flies, as in most cases, when we are short on a Hebrew word, we go to the Greek, and we go to the Septuagint, and they translate a different word, which means dogfly, which means dogfly. So the authors, the translators of Septuagint, had to perform a degree of biblical interpretation, and they fitted in that word dogfly, and that's where we get it from. But we, in our English Bibles, we actually have arov. This was a big discovery, and this was a major eye-opener to me, though it seems like something small to you. It was a major eye-opener. I'll tell you why. Because my first year in Israel, after my daughter began going to school, my daughter went to a regular Israeli school. And in the first year, my favorite time of year is Passover, is Pesach. She went to school, and they did the Pesach Seder in class, kind of just to show all the bits and pieces. And a wonderful book with lots of pictures in it. And part of the book showed all of the different plagues. And one of the plagues was a whole bunch of wild animals running through Egypt. And I couldn't understand where on earth they got that from. But after looking at the Hebrew text more closely, you see the word arov, and they have interpreted it, and this is according to the Targum, Aramaic translation of the Bible, as wild animals, a large mixture of wild animals that went coursing through all of Egypt and causing destruction in that particular way. And that's very much how this tradition is understood in Israel, within the school system there, and even within the churches as well. So if you see a bunch of wild animals, then this may well be a representation of what we know and what we understand as flies. So it is really, really quite different. So we have these 10 plagues, Arov, keep that in mind. And we also have the last plague, which is obviously the plague of the firstborn. This is the big finale. This is the big, mysterious, and frightening thing, if you like, this plague. All of the other plagues, you can kind of begin to write them up as phenomenon in creation. You can say that blood turned into waters. These things have been proved. The Nile goes red sometimes. And you can begin to write it off, all well and good. But the plague of the firstborn, what natural phenomenon will only kill your firstborn male? That's rare. Only once have I known, and that's here, that it's actually happened. But that is a really huge step, because that separates everything. Now we're talking about something which has to be God. It has to have a really intelligent mind behind it, and a powerful mind to be able to do such a thing. So it is very decisive, and it is very mysterious. And so from that, the firstborn of the Egyptians died, even down to the cattle, and this sets the Israelites free. Before the Israelites leave, obviously, another important tradition, very important tradition, they have to request articles of silver and gold from the Egyptians. Very important, very important. So they come out of Egypt with riches, with great riches. This is something often neglected, but we'll see it has ramifications later on. So they leave, they come back to the sea, they see the army chasing them, and here we go, it's that seed of moaning and complaining. Were there no graves in Egypt that you took us here to die? Beautiful complaints, by the way. Just that very idea that Egypt has run out of graves, and so they have to die in the wilderness is a marvelous idea, but nevertheless, it is a complaint. And that's when Moses, with his rod and at God's command, splits the sea, and they pass through, and they journey on. Now, when Moses splits the sea, two things happen. One is it marks deliverance for the Israelites, but two, it adds judgment on the Egyptians. This is something in rabbinic literature they call midah keneged midah. You want me to translate that, don't you? Measure for measure. Measure for measure. Very important biblical principle, very important interpretive principle that goes throughout the Bible. The way in which you do something to somebody else will be done unto you. We see it in the life of Jacob. Jacob deceives Esau, tricks him to get his birthright. He goes to Laban, and what happens? He is tricked concerning and deceived concerning his wife. what he sends out comes back. What goes around comes around. We see Joseph, Joseph's brothers, they imprison his son. They cause their brother, to be imprisoned unrightfully, and as a result, they are subsequently imprisoned in return. What goes around comes around. We have that if we're going to open out into Christian circles. We have coming into the world through one man, sin entered the world and has contaminated many, if you like. And similarly, through one man, we have redemption in Jesus as well. So it's measure for measure. That which is done one way, it also comes the other way. And we see that principle at work right here as well. How was it that Pharaoh wanted to kill the Israelites? By drowning them in the river, in the water. And now, what happens to them, their Israelite males, their fighting force? They are drowned in the river. Just as he wanted it done to them, it comes back unto him. This principle of measure for measure, very broad, goes across the whole Bible. There was a book which has been published on it. I don't know if it's been translated into English yet, but it's a very good book that actually deals with many, many examples of this idea, of this rabbinic idea. So from here they journey to Sinai. They carry on journey to Sinai, and there are a number of divine encounters before they get to Sinai. This is a critical stage, formative stage for the Israelites. Before they even get to Sinai, God is beginning to give them a hint. He's beginning to tell them, to show them that obedience counts. He's beginning to give them a taste of some of the laws, some of the rules, some of the stipulations, if you like, of this covenant agreement that's going to happen. The first of those is going to be when they get to the waters of Marah. They reach bitter waters, and God instructs Moses to take a branch and put it in to make it sweet. And then at that point at the waters of Marah, God says, if you will keep my commands, then I will keep from you the plagues of Egypt. So that's a hint of what's to come. If you keep my commands, it's introducing them to the idea of a covenant relationship, of a deal, if you want, between them and him. They move on from there and they start needing bread and foods to eat. And that's where we have this whole tradition of the manna and the shlav, the quail. We have the bread of heaven. We're going to talk about that, bread from heaven, and the quail. And that's another instance in which, yes, the Israelites complain, but again, God is warning them or preparing them for what's to come, because the big deal about that whole incident with the bread and the manna, the big issue right there is the issue of Shabbat. And God is saying, are you guys going to keep Shabbat? Because what God said was that on Friday night, you can collect a double portion, but on Saturday, on Shabbat, you don't touch it. Don't go out. Don't go collect it. It's not going to be there. You must keep my Shabbat. This is before they get to Sinai. So he's warning them. He's saying, this is what it's going to be like. And, of course, they fail. They fluff that, and some of them go up, and they start looking for manna, and it's simply not there. And God is like, man, you got to get this right, guys. You have to get this right. So the whole question of that testing, if you like, and they play with this throughout biblical literatures, who's testing who? Is God testing them to see if they can eat the manna, or are they testing him and his patience? And that's played, they play amongst that, the interpreters do, throughout biblical literature and beyond. The next part they come to is the water, 17, 1-7, if you're keeping up with me in the Bibles. This is where they run out of water, and here Moses is commanded to strike a rock and to have water flood out for them. I have to keep my eye on the time at all times, good. And water comes out for them, and they have enough to drink. And at the end of this story, we have the big question, the clutch question, and this is the issue. The rabbinic authors, the rabbinic commentators, and I just want to say, speaking of rabbinic commentators, I'm not suggesting that Western commentators don't do their job right or anything like that, but one of the things that rabbinic commentators do is they read texts carefully. They read text carefully. For them, the Bible is the Word of God, and therefore there is meaning in everything. And you have to go and look and see what is being said. Anything that's peculiar, they have to begin to address and speak about. But one of the things which they mention, I think I quite agree with it, is that the whole issue with the water, the question of water, comes in the last line. The last line of that section, I think it's going to be verse 7, 17:7. The big issue of the whole story comes there, and that's when they say, because they tempted the Lord, this is the issue, because they tempted the Lord, saying, is the Lord among us or not? And this is kind of like a sticking point. I'm sure it would have stuck in God's throat, because he's done so much for them already, and they are still doubting his presence among them. That idea is picked up in Psalm 95. Psalm 95 is a psalm that deals with, it's called an entrance liturgy, and it's a psalm that deals with going into the presence of God. And the second part of that psalm, they talk about testing, the Israelites testing God at Massah, which is this place now with the water. They talk about that testing. And the common motif between the two works is the idea of doubting God's presence. The Israelites at Massah and Meribah, when they doubted God's presence among them there, is the same doubt that the psalmist is trying to dispel in Psalm 95. When you walk into the presence of God, when you come into the temple, do not doubt that he is there. Don't be like those Israelites that thought that he's not really among us, or said that he is not really among us, even though he actually was. So that's a very important part of that particular pericope. Moving on from there, we have the next event, which is Amalek. These four stories I'm talking of now, just between the crossing of the sea and the giving of the law, are very, very important in the whole tradition. Very, very important in the whole Exodus tradition, but frequently overlooked. The story of Amalek is critical. It has ramifications throughout the rest of the Bible, throughout literary history. Story of Amalek, the Amalekites come on their way and they start harassing the Israelites. They start, obviously, hitting the outskirts of their camp, causing them problems. And then the Israelites, they say enough is enough. And Joshua gets the mighty men of war together, and he goes out to fight against the Amalekites to defeat them. And that's when Moses goes up on a mountain. He goes up there with Aaron and Hur, if I'm not mistaken, and they go up, and that's the situation where when Moses' hands are up, they are winning the battle. When they're down, they're losing the battle, and they're up, and he's holding them up. He gets tired, and they come down again because he's tired, and he's doing this and this, and they're winning and losing, winning and losing, winning and losing. And then Aaron and Hur come, and they hold his hands up like this, and they win the battle, and they hold their hands up, and in what's called in emunah. That's the word that they use, emunah, which is the word for faith, which means they held them up steadily and consistently at all times, which is what faith is all about, doing something consistently at all times. This passage, this section in Exodus is extremely troublesome. And if we read the text carefully, you think about it, you find it is quite troublesome, because it kind of looks like Moses is doing everything. God is almost taken out of the equation, and Moses' hands have power, because when he raises his hands up, the Israelites are winning, and when they go down, they lose. And this is the type of gap or hole that a lot of the commentators, the middle-aged commentators, the early commentators saw. And they have to begin to plug this up, because it cannot be that Moses' hands are doing anything, because he is just a man. Here's a quick quote from a passage from what's called the Mekilta. The Mekilta is a very early commentary on Exodus. Very early commentary, there are a couple of versions of it. And the Mekilta says this: but did Moses' hands actually make the Israelites win? And was it they that crushed Amalek? Rather, the text means when Moses lifted his hands towards heaven, Israel would look upon him and put their trust in God, who ordered Moses to do so. Then God would perform miracles on their behalf, which is nice. Bring God into the equation. We also have, and I'll bring a quick quote as well from a Targum, what's called the Targum. I mentioned them before. These are Aramaic translations of the Bible, and they're very valuable because they show us the seeds of early biblical interpretation. So it says, the Targum says, whenever Moses would lift his hands in prayer, to explain that. So Moses' hands going up, he was praying. And so they have to bring God into the equation because they fully understand that Moses by himself really can't do much at all. Another important thing about this passage concerning the Amalekites, very important, is that at the end of this story, God gets pretty angry with the Amalekites. And he promises, or he seeks, or he states at least in the future, that he would blot out the memory of the Amalekites forever. That is something God is determined to do. What they did was hideous. What they did was repulsive. It was cheap, if you like, and God has to do something about that. And this idea it's there. He promised to do it. We see it show up a couple more times in the Bible. We see it come up in the book of Samuel, 1 Samuel 15:9, because it's there in 1 Samuel 15, God tells Saul, or Shaul, he tells him, you have to do it. You are going to be my agent. You have to destroy these Amalekites. And he goes out and he says he does, and Samuel confronts him, and Samuel says, you destroyed all of them, and Saul says, yes. And you destroyed everything, and Saul says, yes. And Samuel says, well, what is this bleating in my ears? What is this noise? And Saul clearly hadn't destroyed all of them. He had left at least some of their cattle and sheep alive, and that's what he says, and probably left people alive too. I'll tell you in a minute why I say that. The leader of the Amalekites at this stage is whom? Is Agag, a man called Agag, who comes out before Samuel, and Samuel in the end slays this guy Agag. But the story doesn't end there. It carries on because in the book of Esther, we see Haman, who is what? An Agagite. What does that link you to? These Amalekites which Saul did not put down. These Amalekites, which should have been destroyed, God wanted to destroy them. He didn't do it. He didn't do his job, and so it has ramifications further down. And it's this Haman who continues to seek to try and destroy the Jewish people later on. All the way down in the book of Esther, all the way down there, which is one of the last books ever to be written in the Bible, we have repercussions from what? From the Exodus motif. From what happened to the Israelites in that desert period. It has far-reaching effects. I am looking at the time, honestly. So we move on. They destroy the Amalekites, and they move on to Jethro. They come down to the bottom of the mountain to Jethro, and this is Moses' father-in-law, and that's another very strange encounter. It's something that has to be explained. What is this non-Israelite doing? Why is he getting so much honor and respect from Moses? Moses listens to his advice. This non-Israelite is instructing Moses on how to judge, separating the people into groups, separating into tiers, into a hierarchy so he's not taking on such a heavy load. Who is this non-Israelite to tell him to do that? That's ridiculous. Has to be explained. And Moses kissing him and greeting him and giving him all kinds of respect as well. That's a bit problematic. We don't see anything else of Jethro specifically mentioned, but I will just mention Psalm 135, verse 5, "For I know that our Lord is great, and that our God is above all gods." That verse there is a direct quotation from the words of Jethro in Exodus 17:11, I believe. The words this was one of my, I'm kind of deviating, one of my, in my dissertation, Psalm 135 was one of them. I did quite a close literary study on that to find out where different parts of the Exodus motif come from, and this is a direct quotation from this Gentile man, Jethro, but nevertheless has a nice contribution to the psalm. We then move to the giving of the law. Much of Exodus 19 onwards is dedicated to that. Giving of the law, the law. Obviously a horrible, horrible, horrible designation, the law, because it's almost anything but that. It's almost anything but that. It is a covenant agreement, covenant stipulations which they go into. In academic circles, they call the book of Exodus from 1920 on pretty much through to the end, they call it the covenant code, which is really quite a nice description because that is what it is. It is about a covenant that is being set up. God has shown who he is and what he can do, and now they have to sit down and agree as to whether they want to carry on with it or not. And they all agree. They all say, yes, we will do exactly as you say. Now, I just want to say, again, it's so difficult not to get drawn out into these other issues. But nevertheless, this idea of the covenant here is critical. Critical, again, for understanding our faith in whom we are. It's critical because what people fail to understand and fail to see is that the law, this covenant is established after salvation, after they are delivered, after they have been redeemed, after he has shown who he is. That is when this is established, and this is one of my battles in my Old Testament class. It is not a question of doing good to earn this kind of salvation. It is a question of having received the salvation, having received the deliverance, to then be wanting to know how you can likewise respond. What can I do for this? Wow, you've done this great thing. What do I need to do back for you? How can I give this back to you? And it's more of a way, a vehicle of response that has been given. So, okay, I've done this. Now you can do this. And then to continue in that relationship, you find the people who constantly appreciate what has been done for them, they live in accordance to keep that lawgiver, that deliverer, happy to stay on his right side. So it's not a question of a law first to earn salvation, but that turned on its head. It's salvation first, and then we respond. This is not a church, but it is a church. I'm not going to go into preach. I'm not going to go into that. I'm not going to go into there, but hopefully you can see that there's a clear application as the way in which we relate to our salvation as well. I'm not going to go there. I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to do it. Another thing I need to say about the law as well, particularly the Ten Commandments, another misconception. We understand the Ten Commandments as Ten Commandments. It's never called the Ten Commandments. In the Bible, it's called Eser HaDevorot, the 10 words, the 10 things, the 10 matters. And they really are just that. And throughout they're kind of like principles or ideas, if you like, and they need expounding. They have to be expounded upon because otherwise they make absolutely no sense. It says in the Bible, do not murder. What does that mean? What does it mean to murder? That is not a clear command. I'm telling you, that is not clear. What does it mean? Does it mean to pick up a knife and to throw it in somebody's back and kill them? Is that murder? You say, well, yeah, it's murder. What if I hired a hitman to do it? Am I killing anyone? Am I murdering anyone? Is that murder? It clearly is murder, isn't it? But it's not a physical act anymore. It's not a physical act. If I hire a hitman, somebody else is going to do it. In that sense, I'm kind of clean, but I've still committed murder. And this process, this needs to understand and interpret the Ten Commandments and the rest of the commandments is something we see throughout the biblical period. We see, obviously, Jesus catches onto this very well. He understands it. And what does Jesus say? If you just hate someone in your heart, that's murder. Well, of course it is, because the act, this is where it begins. And so Jesus, in that command, Jesus is interpreting. He's seeing the space, the gap, which is in the original commands, and he's making it more applicable, giving it detail and fleshing it out. This thing happens throughout the whole of the Bible, and this is a separate lecture, the Ten Commandments and their effects on the Bible and society. But I'm not going to go there just now. I'm going to say that it's a bit more complex than it initially looks. Keep checking the time, Good. I'm okay. I'm another 10, 15 minutes. We'll see how it goes. So we've got the Ten Commandments being given out. And interspersed among there, chapter 32 and 34, is the question. Moses is still on the mountain, and here we go. This guy, Aaron, okay, slightly incited by the Israelites, but he makes God, doesn't he? They say, where is our God? He's dead. And Aaron says, okay, give me your earrings, give me your gold. And he takes all of this gold, puts it in a pot. Out pops this golden calf. And they begin to worship it. They don't just begin to worship it. Something very critical is actually said. Aaron turns around and he says, be careful, listen to his words, we're going to come back to them. Here is your God, O Israel, who brought you up from the land of Egypt. That's what he says. That's important, those words. Here is your God, O Egypt, who brought you up from the land of Egypt. And they worship and they have a huge festival, if you like, concerning this. Moses hears of it and goes down, and from it, he gets the Levites, they agree, and they go out, they slay 3,000 people, of their own brothers. They kill them for what they're doing. And you must note in that particular story, Aaron is never implicated. He's never accused. He comes out squeaky clean. I'm saying that now because it's a habit, it's a pattern. Throughout the Bible, Aaron seems to come out squeaky clean in every case. And it may be something to do with the fact that his is the line of the priesthood, but he averts this with just amazing skill. Nothing ever sticks to him. So he comes out, he escapes this situation. And then from there, Moses obviously goes back up. He takes down the two stones. They get remade, and he comes back down again. There have to be two stones, and this is, again, these things, some of these things get trivial. They're trivial to other people, but they mean a lot to me. The two stones, and they normally have the first 5 commandments and the second 5 commandments. And it was never like that. They would have had 2 sets of commandments on the stones. They make copies of everything. Why? Because they're in a covenant. When you make a covenant with people, you write it twice, so that both parties have a copy of what is written. And that's why he comes down with these 2 stones with the commandments written on them. That's what's going on there. So he comes back down. They build the tabernacle. Again, that's a separate issue. I'm not going to go there. But they build the tabernacle, and they move on out into the desert. And from there, we have to pick up the story in the book of Numbers. Numbers, I will tell you now, is a difficult book to read. I'm not going to lie. It's a difficult book to read. There are a lot of lists. There's the census at the beginning and the end. There's laws interspersed. But within the book of Numbers, we nevertheless have the remainder of the tale of what happens in the desert. And it is wholly negative in what's going on. We see unspecified complaints in chapter 11, 1-3. We don't know what's going on, and some fires are sent by God to punish some of the Israelites. We see that. 12, 1-16, we have Miriam and Aaron. They challenge Moses' authority. Beautiful passage. Read the first few verses of that. I think it's a beautiful passage because it just goes to show how devious people are. Let me read it. Let's just quickly go there now. Numbers 12 from verse 1. Just quickly. Sorry, I don't like using this thing. Numbers 12, 1. Then Miriam and Aaron spoke against Moses because of the Ethiopian woman he had married. For he had married an Ethiopian woman. So they said, did they say, Moses, we don't like you because you've married an Ethiopian? No, they don't say that. That doesn't sound right, okay? So they say, has the Lord indeed spoken only through Moses? So they have one issue, both of them, and they're cornering him on something entirely different. Entirely different. And as a result of this, they are punished. I say they are punished, but once again, Miriam is punished. She is made leprous, and Aaron, squeaky clean. He comes out of it. He doesn't get leprosy. He's the high priest. you know? And so, intercession is made, offering is made. Miriam gets it again. She is healed, and they do get to go on. But we have this challenge of the authority again. We're going to see this whole Aaron thing. It continues all of the time. So they go on from there. Then in chapters 13 and 14, there's the first attempt at the promised land. They attempt to do it, and they fail. Only 12 spies went out. 2 come back, which is Joshua and Caleb. Going on from there, throughout the book of Numbers, it's much of the same thing. We've got the Korah, Dathan, and Abiram. They stand up again against Moses and Aaron, saying, "Why are you exalting yourself in front of all of the community? We are good too." And as a result of that, there's a test of the censers. They have to bring these incense bowls before God to see which one God accepts. A number of them are burned then. And we find, in the biblical account at least, we find Korah, Dathan, and Abiram. They stay in their tents, and the ground opens up and swallows them and all of their rebellious group together. We're going to see that also again a little later on. So they move on. We also get in chapter 17 the budding of Aaron's, another idea of selection. This idea of priesthood and selection is very important, and we get more affirmation of whom God chooses when the authority is challenged and everybody leaves their staff out, and overnight Aaron's buds with almonds and everything, which is a wonderful picture. So that idea of selection of Aaron is there again. All the time there are challenges to authority. All the time there are rebellion. All the time there are complaints going on. And then there's another water story in 21 to 13. Just after Miriam died, this is going to be important as well. Miriam dies, and then there's another problem with water. And Moses, it's another rock again. Moses instructed to God, and this is the whole point of contention, what went down, and we're still not 100% clear, but it would appear as though God told Moses to speak to the rock, and he struck the rock, and yes, they got water, but in that incident, Moses is condemned for not sanctifying God's name. What exactly he did wrong, a little bit difficult to say. Was it that he didn't speak to the rock to show his faith? Maybe, possibly. Was it that he says, "Must we bring you water from the rock?" Those are his words. "Must we bring you?" Moses can't do anything. What's he talking about we for? God is going to do it. It's not us. It's not we. This is all about God. So that might be something else which doesn't sanctify God's name. But anyway, because of that, God is pretty upset and says, "Moses, you're not going to see the promised land now," which seems a little bit excessive, just on one thing after all that Moses has gone through. But that's another issue, Old Testament ethics. I'm not going to go into that right now either. So after that, we begin to see some of the conquest stories. They try to go through Moab, but are refused. And then we have the incident again. More complaints. Chapter 21, talking about chapter 21, more complaints. And there's this issue of the serpents. God punishes them by sending these snakes around that start killing people. And so Moses puts this serpent up on this bronze serpent up on this flag post, and whoever looks up at it sees it and is saved. And again, what goes on here has repercussions further down the line, way further down the line, in the days of Hezekiah. 2 Kings 18:4. 2 Kings 18:4. Days of Hezekiah, we find that when Hezekiah is leading his reform, he is clearing out the temple, and one of the things he finds is this bronze serpent that Moses had. They called him Nehushtan, and this turned into an idol, and it turned into a god, and it's something which they had had for so long, but it began all the way back in the Exodus tradition. So they have the bronze serpent incident, more rebellion, and then in chapters 22 to 24, they come across again, it's Balak, the king, and Bilam, his prophet, if you like. Balak pays Balaam to curse them, and he tries to curse them, but every time he does, 3 times, he ends up blessing them instead. These 2 chapters, 22 to 23, contain some very ancient Hebrew poetry, which is very difficult to understand, but nevertheless very, very beautiful. So Balak can't trick them that way, and so he gets them the other way, and it's the women at this time, and they go out and they seduce the Israelites into performing kinds of cultic acts which really shouldn't be performed at all. And whilst this is happening, a plague apparently breaks out, and we have this individual, Phinehas, who comes with his zeal. We'll hear from him a bit later as well. He comes with his zeal, and he picks up a spear, and he kills 2 people, thrusting them together, pinning them to the ground. And for that, God says, wow, I'm going to establish with you an everlasting covenant of peace, which is not really clear exactly what he means. But like I say, we're going to see Phinehas again a bit later on in another tradition. So we have, they do that. And after that, the Israelites then move on to begin conquering the land. They first, I don't have a map, but they first conquer the lands east of the Jordan. They go through 2 giants, one giant, Og and Sihon. Og, they said afterwards that he was something like 9 feet tall. He was a giant, a monster of a guy. But in both of these cases, this warrants another story, but I'm not going to go there. But in both of these cases, the Israelites go and say, can we pass through your land? And the kings immediately come out to fight. And so the Israelites fight, defeat them, and conquer and take their lands. These are lands east of the Jordan, something which I think it's almost like a bonus that actually happened. And that's really where the conquest begins. That's where Moses dies on the mountains, and he gets to take a peek over into the promised land. And Moses' death is actually recorded in the end of Deuteronomy. This is another story that is shrouded in a degree of mystery. We don't properly know where was he buried. It said God buried him. What on earth does that mean? Nobody knows where his grave is. We don't know exactly what happens to him. And that degree of mystery appears later in Second Temple literature, and the theory has it that he never actually dies. And that's why we see in the book of Revelation, we see Moses and we see Elijah, 2 individuals who in Jewish tradition never died. That's why they can be walking about the holy city, witnessing against it. But that's another story for another time. So I can begin to wrap things up now. Now we have the basic tradition. Now we have the story from which the Israelites were delivered. They were taken from slavery and captivity, and through an act of mercy and grace, they were brought into, at least here, the verges of the promised land. And they are brought in the place of promise, and obviously they were brought into a contract agreement with God. And I'm going to go back to where I began, this is why I say it is important. Anyone comes to you as a new believer, that they know this story first, because it was here first. And once they have this down, now any notions of their salvation, where they go from being saved from sin, delivered from sin, coming into a contractual agreement with God and living for Him, now this makes more sense. Now it's in a larger framework. We begin with the Exodus motif.
Do you have any comments or questions about this lecture? Write us, the Center, at jcstudies.com. Also, check out jcstudies.com for more teaching resources dedicated to authentic discipleship from a Hebraic perspective. Shalom.